This is the story of two sisters traveling to a remote part of Ireland, inspired by the audacity of 6th century monks who built a life on a rock in the Atlantic off the coast of Ireland. And we hope to see puffins too.
We started out from our country cottage named Needin Cuin, which means little quiet nest. The cottage is near Glenville, Cork, and from there we headed down the road. Our first stop was Glengarriff, where we walked along the waterfront, over beautiful bridges, and then through the town. After lunch, we headed out for a leisurely drive to the Valencia Island. If anything about the windy, narrow Irish roads can be considered leisurely.
We were wonderfully gifted by our cottage host Ann Buttimer with the use of her Nissan Micra car. A very small car, which really was very good at working with these Irish narrow roads. We were given signs along the way about things that were coming up, not always what you'd expect, and in fact some of the most difficult times were for larger vehicles to try to pass each other, so here we are waiting for two buses to try to get past one another. Grass-covered rocky hedges made that even more difficult because they couldn't really move up the hedges any to get around each other, but they did. After we passed that, we began to see the beautiful scenery of the Rings of Kerry. There's so many lovely sights here, country sights, water sights, gorgeous sights. It's easy to see why lots of tourists come here, and we were among them, and it was hard to pick the pictures to show.
Eventually, we arrived at our bed and breakfast, which is located on the beautiful Valencia Island. It measures 11 by 3 kilometers, and once we dropped off our bags, we headed for the high point. Looking out from Geokum mountain, the vistas are beautiful and plentiful. You can even see the Skellig Islands, and from there we headed to the Fulmar cliffs. Did I mention that Ireland is windy? Here's Rosemary with the wind blowing the back of her coat up over her head and almost her glasses off her face. And here's me, my hair won't stop blowing in my face. Beyond that, we had the dramatic views of the Fulmar cliffs.
Teresa's taking pictures during our trip of various Catholic cultural icons in Ireland. And so the grotto is on the Valencia Island mountain at the slate quarry. Here we see an iconic statue of Mary perched high on the quarry cliff. You can barely see it up there.
For the evening, we headed back to Portmagee, once again to a pub, and after some Irish music and dance, we headed back across the bridge to our bed and breakfast, where we slept a good night. In the morning, we awoke to the famous full Irish breakfast, as well as a gentle Irish mist and a unwelcome fog. The fog was unwelcome because the boats can't take travelers out to the islands unless the weather allows. So we were concerned about what we would find when we once again crossed the bridge. Oh, hooray! We found an award-winning loo. Ireland is famous for giving awards for things like tidy towns, and toilets are no exception. So we were delighted to visit the loo in preparation for our adventure ahead.
Since Skellig Michael is a National Heritage Site, there are strict limits on how many people can visit it every day. Boats can only go out once a day and each take 10 or 12 people. This is the type of boat we were on. The locals are concerned about the possible closing of the Skellig and its economic effects for them. The concern arises around recent safety concerns of 2 deaths in the last few years and a lawsuit from U.S. tourist families over these deaths. Nonetheless, we, at around 10 a.m., joined 10 other souls on a small tour boat piloted by Finn, who knew a lot about the area. The sea journey was wet and picturesque, and we were able to see some dolphins along the way. So you'll have to look for these on this little video. So let's watch for the dolphins.
And there's another one. When we arrived at Skellig Michael, we carefully leapt from the boat to the dock And then we traversed this well-maintained and guard-railed, very safe path to the base of the steps. Once there, we received our warning. There's a little tour person standing at the top who won't let you pass until you know that you could die. But did that stop us? No! We went forward, and we were greeted by a cacophony of bird song. Some of the birds we saw when we traveled there were the fulmar. We also saw some smaller gulls, the kittiwake, and we saw the rock pipit, who was too small to photograph well, though we saw many of them. Our favorites by far, however, were the auks. Here are some razorbill auks, and you can see this kind of feisty couple. And even more charming to us were the puffins. On the left, we have the one that's going to make a getaway. And on the right is the little guy who waddles very nicely for us. There were so many puffins, there was no need for us to worry about seeing any. There were hundreds of puffins there. Because it's nesting season, the puffins were everywhere. Here's one poking out from underneath a step, but there were others who were nesting in the ruins themselves, and pretty much everywhere you looked, you found some bird nesting or collecting material for a nest.
So now it was time to climb the 600 steps up to the monastery ruins and the beehive dwellings. These monks were incredible in the building that they did to build this place for themselves so far away from the rest of humanity. Being here on a wet and windy day made the austerity of the life they lived even more apparent. Here's a rock ledge around the edge that's pretty confining, but you can see the depth that you would fall if you weren't careful. And here's close to the edge.
Stooping under the archways made us wonder just how diminutive these monks might have been, or how agile. Here are the beehive huts, which were the favored dwelling for the discerning cloistered monk in Ireland during that day. They were built with the process of dry stacking, which is difficult and very labor-intensive, but pretty durable.
It was difficult to know how someone could live in that kind of small, confined space. They were very dark, but most of them had at least one window, and this is a picture taken from one of the beehive huts looking out over the graveyard. The graveyard itself was very interesting, and you can see gravestones on both sides looking as if people were double stacked, but that wasn't the case. The gravestones on the right are the original. The ones on the left have been brought here by the conservators of the site in order to protect them from further decay, as gravestones were found all over the island wherever there was a spot that something could be dug in order for someone to be buried. So we had to stop our tourist-like behavior and move down the steps. Again, looking at the steps here, you can see the artistry with which these monks had completed their task and how difficult that must have been. This doesn't look so dangerous, but this is the sort of geology through which these steps were built. And so when we see the steps down here, you can see the steps were through this area where there's stone on both sides. That's not very much protection, but it's more protection than what you might get in a situation like this, where you're heading straight down the grass on both sides, but nothing to stand by or hold on to. And here, on this day particularly, the wetness made the traversing rather difficult and precarious. These kinds of stone promontories sticking out would not be something very pleasant to fall upon.
So promptly at 1:30, we climbed back onto the boat and headed for a tour around Little Skellig. Finn gave us a ride all the way around the small island, and the closer we got, the more the island looked like it was alive. The inhabitants of the island are the gannets. No other birds are allowed on the island. They're a monoculture, and they're the largest seabird in the North Atlantic. Here you see them a little closer. When you look at them from this view, it's easy to believe that almost a quarter of the world's population of gannets call Little Skellig home. The two islands recede into the distance, and I take one last opportunity to photograph my dear and beloved sister.